Thanks a lot, Bernard, for the introduction. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a great pleasure to virtually visit you. So I'm presenting a joint work with Robert, who's also in the audience, Deceptive Features on Platforms. The paper was called Deceptive Products on Platforms before, and now we changed it to Deceptive Features on Platforms. Okay, so our starting point is that products sold on online platforms often have additional fees or features. Here are a couple of examples. Back in the days when we used airplanes, these flight aggregator websites where you have a basic ticket price for a flight, and you also have additional fees for, say, check-in luggage, additional luggage, speedy boarding, or upgrade to business class. Think about hotel booking websites where you have a basic room rate, and then you have service upgrades in the hotel for like restaurant access to the gym access, room service, faster Wi-Fi, and so on. You can think more generally about price comparison websites, where you can buy your basic, say, your iPhone, but then there are also additional fees. You have to pay for shipping, maybe a bit more for faster shipping. You have add-ons. You can have complimentary insurance, for example, for your iPhone, or you have upgrades. You can have your iPhone in some funky color, for example. Final example, because there's some nice evidence in this context, there are event ticket platforms where you can get basic concert tickets and then upgrades, for example, to better seats, and there are also service fees often applicable on these platforms. So there are additional fees and features on many online marketplaces, and in recent years, policymakers are getting increasingly concerned and increasingly active about platforms hiding these fees. Right? So the concern is that these fees are often a bit obfuscated. Here are a couple of examples. We have more in the paper. Recently, the EU pressured Airbnb to display prices that include the host's cleaning fees. Right? So prior to that, you would only see the cleaning fees kind of later on, closer to checkout, and the EU pressured Airbnb to reveal these fees earlier up front when potential guests could compare different hosts. The US Department of Transport obliged online travel agents to display total ticket prices that include all unavoidable features and fees. And in the UK, the CMA pressured Viagogo, an event ticket platform, to stop obfuscating seller fees. Right, so that's the context. There are these additional fees and features on many online marketplaces, and there is a concern that platforms don't do enough to make these fees transparent. And so that's the key research question we ask. So we ask, why do platforms hide fees? In particular, as in some of these examples, why do platforms hide fees they do not even earn themselves? Right? So fees of third-party sellers on their marketplace. And so then, as a follow-up, we ask when and how regulators should intervene. Before I foreshadow some results, I want to quickly take a slide to give you some background of our analysis and some important features also of these markets we're looking at. So the first key feature is, this is a paper on two-sided platform, so there'll be cross-group externalities between buyers and sellers. Really, just this idea that, if you have more buyers on this marketplace, this makes the marketplace more valuable for sellers. And if you have more sellers, this makes the marketplace more valuable for buyers. So then we kind of, in our work, we look at platforms kind of as designers of these online marketplaces. So they don't just manage these cross-group externalities using fees. They also design the marketplace itself. In particular, in our context, the platforms will be able to shroud or unshroud additional fees, meaning they either make them less transparent, or if they unshroud them, make them more transparent. Here's one example for practice that platforms can use to shroud fees. It's called drip pricing. Maybe if you haven't heard the name, it's something you're very, very surely quite familiar with. It's very widely used on platforms. It just means that instead of showing fees early upfront to buyers when they choose a seller, some fees are only revealed later on during the purchase process. So here's an example from Google Travel. This was from early 2020, before the lockdown started. So if you're a Google user in the US, Canada, or Israel, and you would look for hotels via Google Travel, you would only see the hotels listed by their base rate, and these base rates would not include fees and taxes, right? So those you would only learn later on. However, if you use Google Travel outside of these 3 countries, then base rates would by default include taxes and additional fees, right? So you very much see, depending on where you are, you have more upfront pricing or you have more drip pricing, and you see that it's very much a design feature of the platform, up to regulation. It's very much a design feature of the platform, whether to use upfront pricing or drip pricing, whether to make fees more transparent or less transparent early on in the purchase process. Now, another example for shrouding, or in this context, rather making things more transparent, is banner warnings that can pop up to warn you about something that might happen later. I mean, he used a positive example of Google in case someone of them sees this talk. So this is Google flights now. So this was, I think, Robert booking a flight to Brussels. And so he booked one via Ryanair. And you see here, so that, after he chose his flight that he wanted to book, there was this pop-up window here where he was warned that there might likely be fees for additional fees for carry-on bags or for check-in luggage that they did not depict yet on the website, right? So this is also a way to at least warn consumers a little bit about additional things to come, additional fees that sellers might charge later on in the booking process. Right, so there are cross-group externalities. Platforms can, make fees more or less transparent. And the third key feature is kind of the question, kind of what does this transparency do to consumers? So we take the perspective here that there are consumer mistakes, right? So meaning some buyers will underestimate their costs of buying a product when fees are shrouded. Also here, drip pricing is a well-researched example. There's quite some evidence that drip pricing induces at least some consumers to underestimate total expenses, and these effects can be quite large. Here's an example from a paper from Blake Tadelis and co-authors. It was recently published in Management Science, I think. So they look at an event ticket platform, StubHub, and StubHub moved from upfront pricing to drip pricing of a 15% fee. And so they could do some RCTs kind of during this transition process. And what's really nice is they could really randomize whether users saw drip pricing or saw the upfront pricing version, and everything else was equal between these 2 comparison groups. And they find that drip pricing, a 15% fee, boosts revenues by 21%, right? So, and since everything else is equal, the fees were otherwise the same, except for the way how they were shown to people. This is very much an effect coming from a demand increase. So here's another example, quite known paper by Chetty and co-authors. That's kind of drip pricing, brick and mortar store, if you will, right? So they look at kind of not mentioning sales taxes on the price tags in a supermarket. You would only see the amount of the sales tax later on at checkout when you pay. And here they show that hiding these sales tax using drip pricing increases revenues by around 8%. There's also extensive evidence for shipping fees, and that's also a lot of evidence for online marketplaces, where the picture is usually the same. Consumers are much more sensitive to changes in base prices than to changes in shipping fees, in particular because platforms use versions of drip pricing. Right, so those will be the key 3 features. There will be cross-group externalities. Platforms can kind of make fees more or less transparent, and the transparency influences the degree to which consumers correctly take fees into account or not. Okay, so then let me foreshadow.
Johannes, a quick question by Dan Savelle.
Yes, please.
How should we think about fees that depend on the individual's additional choices? Checked bag fees are not always paid. Similar check bags. Is this drip pricing or something different?
Yeah, so also there, kind of, I would say, to the extent that platforms can make them transparent to people early on or not, the same things apply, right? So you could, for example, make very transparent that this ticket price does not include carry-on luggage, or you could just not talk about it. Right. So also there, when that's a choice to consumers, also then you could make things more or less transparent using different forms of drip pricing, I'd say.
Just to make sure, drip pricing is more about there is a price you will eventually pay no matter what, and they're just telling you about it slowly, fee by fee, right? Versus choices among a platter of options.
I see. So the drip pricing, how I understand the term, is that it's kind of you just certain price components you will just figure out later on, and it's it can be stuff that you have to pay, it can be stuff you don't have to pay. But there are very similar, very many similar terms out there. So but that's what we have in mind when we use the term. Okay. So the key takeaway I hope I can convince you of during this talk is that cross-group externalities give platforms strong incentives to shroud additional fees. And so the key idea is, because of cross-group externalities, you want to attract many buyers to the platform. So that means the platform wants to appear cheap towards buyers to attract very many of them. And one way of doing that is to shroud fees, right? So even when you don't earn them yourself. So we back this kind of key takeaway up with two key findings, two key results. The first one is that we show that platforms have stronger incentives to shroud seller fees than sellers themselves on a laissez-faire platform where sellers can choose on their own whether to shroud or not. So the basic intuition is that unshrouding has a demand externality that the platform internalizes, but other sellers wouldn't. So the idea is, if I'm an individual seller, I know my rival on the platform shrouds his fees, then I can unshroud my fees to show to sophisticated buyers that I'm cheaper. However, by unshrouding, I also show to naive buyers that products are more expensive than they thought. Right? So that's why I might reduce demand for other sellers on the platform, even though I individually as a seller can increase my own demand. Right? So the individual seller only cares about its own demand, so it wouldn't internalize this kind of externality coming from unshrouding, this externality coming from competing by transparency. But the platform, of course, because of cross-group externalities, cares about having many buyers on the platform. So the platform internalizes externality more, and therefore it wants to prevent sellers from unshrouding. Sorry. Right. So let me emphasize again: this holds even though the platforms do not earn a cut from sellers' fees. Right. So this is really only driven by cross-group externalities. Now, the other key finding relates now to how platforms want to shroud their own additional fees they might charge on a marketplace. And here we show that fiercer competition between sellers can have a perverse effect on transparency. Kind of if there's fiercer competition between sellers, this attracts more buyers to the platform, and this incites the platform to earn money from these sellers by shrouding its own additional fees. Right, so this we think somewhat nuances the common argument that platforms encourage competition. We say that exactly because they encourage competition, they might have a stronger incentive to be intransparent about their own fees. So then we have a couple of policy implications. First and foremost, that if you care about transparency on platforms, maybe you shouldn't rely only on platforms' own incentives to protect consumers in this way. Second, there are a couple of policies that you often hear in policy debates and that are backed up by the economic literature. I'll talk about this a bit more in a couple of slides. Right, so you might want to think about banning commissions that intermediaries might earn, because intermediaries might give biased advice because they're pushed towards selling certain products because they earn more commissions from them, or intermediaries might give biased advice because they sell their own brands, right? So for example, in the context of divesting Amazon, people often propose that Amazon should choose to either sell its own products or have third-party sellers on the marketplace, but not have both, right? So what our work suggests is that both of these policies might not be enough to induce a transparent marketplace, right? So neither of these features is present in our model. Platforms don't earn commissions and they don't sell their own brands, yet they still have an incentive to be intransparent, just driven by cross-group externalities. So then we also look at more kind of concrete regulative interventions, right? So forcing platforms to be transparent, or forcing platforms or directly regulating additional fees. And there we show that kind of the effect of these policies very much depends on which fees you target with it. If you target seller fees with these policies, you might have spillovers and induce platforms to unshroud their own fees. So you might have a positive spillover effect on transparency. However, if you target platforms' fees, you might more robustly benefit buyers. And so the basic reason is, if you target platform fees with policies, platforms will earn less money with it, but the basic membership fees platforms charge will not go up. You will not have some sort of waterbed effect. And the reason is that, cross-group externalities drive platforms to keep membership fees low, even when they lose money on additional fees. So that's why the benefits of these regulation will really kind of one-to-one benefit consumers. So that's the key overview of the results. So I would now kind of try to fill this with a bit more meaning. So let me start by going to the literature. So our work is closely related to two strands of literature that have been mostly disconnected so far. So the literature on two-sided platforms and on deceptive products. We connect to the literature on two-sided platforms. So this literature, few papers, to my understanding, consider add-ons, a product with add-ons on two-sided markets. There are some, but not very many. But what I haven't seen at all is, I think there's no other paper that looks at consumer mistakes, right? So I think all existing papers that I've seen consider rational consumers. And as I'll argue below, so these models with rational consumers, they cannot really explain the evidence that drip pricing increases demand. Right? So intuitively, if you just have rational consumers, the thing that drip pricing does is increases search costs and transaction costs. So everything else equal, if you increase search costs or transaction costs, demand should go down. But that's not what we observe. Demand goes up, right? So, and that's something we can explain in our setting, as you will see hopefully later.
Johannes?
Yes.
Hi. So just one comment in the paper by Heiko Kahle, consumers are not fully rational, right? Because they do single homing while even when there are multiple platforms. So here, what you're saying here is not completely correct. So their consumers are not completely rational. They need a type of irrationality. It's probably not related to what you're doing, but you have to be careful here.
Thanks a lot for the hint. So as far as I understood it, you don't need irrational behavior to not have consumers multi-homing. Just some sort of costs for multi-homing would also work. But I'll have a look at that. Thank you. I'll think about this more carefully. So then we also connect to the literature on deceptive products. So these articles could possibly explain why platforms shroud their own fees, right? Because they can directly benefit from it. But these articles cannot easily explain why platforms shroud fees they do not earn themselves, in particular when there are no commissions, right? So, and this is also something that we can explain via cross-group externalities. Then there's also literature on biased intermediaries. I already hinted at that on the last slides. So there, to my reading of the literature, mainly two reasons why intermediaries might give biased advice. First, because they might earn commissions to push certain products. Second, because they favor their own products. So we have kind of a third channel, an alternative channel, where platforms might design an intransparent marketplace to push cross-group externalities, right? So you want to look cheap, even when the fees you hide you don't earn themselves, because by looking cheap you attract many buyers to the marketplace, and that's something you can benefit from. Okay, then I would go into the basic model. So we start. I'm going to show you kind of the simplest version of our model, where we have a monopoly platform. And so the model is essentially two parts, if you will. There's first the platform design stage, and then there is competition on the platform taking place. So how does the platform design the marketplace? So the monopoly platform sets membership fees and chooses whether to shroud or unshroud seller fees. And then buyers and sellers choose to join the platform or not. Right, so then buyers and sellers are on the platform, and then the second part takes place where there's competition on the platform. So this is just a rough image of how this works. So you have sellers in product categories that look a bit like X with 2 dots here. So that just means each product category has 2 sellers in it. So you have some competition in each product category, and buyers then can buy products in each product category, and they will buy one product from one of the sellers in these product categories. So each seller, each seller competes with one other one in their product categories, and we have 2 types of buyers. We have a share alpha of naive ones, and the remaining buyers we call sophisticated. So now I'll zoom into how competition on the platform looks like in more detail. So it's basically in each product category we have a version of a hoteling model. So in each product category, sellers have marginal cost C, and they sit at opposite ends of a hoteling line of length 1, right? So you can think of this product category, for example, as flights from Brussels to Frankfurt, if you use the flight aggregator example. And so then these sellers, they charge a base price F for seller S, and an additional price A for seller S that's capped by some A upper bar, right? So this captures that you have additional features. So you have a basic ticket price, and there are additional fees, for example, for extra luggage, for check-in luggage, or for upgrades to business class. Then buyers, they have a value V for each product, so that's large, such that the market is covered. So we really want to have competition on this hoteling line. In each category, buyers draw their type, so whether they're naive or sophisticated, and their uniformly distributed location. So those are, both of these are simplifying assumptions. And they have a linear transportation cost, T, that just captures product differentiation. So now what's, when buyers choose a product, all buyers always observe the base prices, right? The base price is F. But buyers observe shrouded additional fees, they don't observe them initially, right? So that means when fees are shrouded, buyers basically have to choose only based on base prices, and they don't see additional fees. So now these 2 buyer types, they differ by how they take shrouded additional fees into account, right? So these naive buyers, they falsely believe shrouded additional fees are 0, right? So this just captures the idea that some consumers make mistakes. In the flight aggregator example, think of consumers who falsely believe check-in luggage is included, or who just underestimate how much they'll later have to pay for check-in luggage or for upgrades to business class. Then these sophisticated consumers, they're kind of more suspicious consumers. They have correct Bayesian posteriors about shrouded fees, and they can kind of act on their suspicion. They can initiate some effort E that's costly to try to avoid the additional fees. Right, so these consumers, for example, if they go to a flight comparison websites, they are suspicious about check-in luggage fees, even when they are not disclosed. So these consumers will take precautions. For example, they might make sure they don't overpack to avoid any fees later on. Okay, now the key novel feature in relation to existing work is that it's the platform that designs the marketplace. The platform shrouds or unshrouds sellers' additional fees. Right, and unshrouding seller fees does 2 things. Unshrouding makes additional fees observable at the stage where buyers choose a seller, and unshrouding turns all naive buyers into sophisticated ones. Right, so this is a simplifying assumption. All results are robust when unshrouding only affects some arbitrarily small share of naive consumers, but we just simplify exposition here and say unshrouding turns all naive buyers into sophisticated ones. Right, so this really captures the idea that the platform can design a marketplace, hide certain fees of sellers towards consumers, or be more upfront about these fees and show them to consumers. Okay, then to wrap up, this is how the timing of the model looks like. Here you have these first 2 stages, again, that capture the platform design of the marketplace. Right, so the platform chooses membership fees of buyers and sellers, and whether to shroud or unshroud seller fees. and then buyers and sellers choose to join the marketplace. And then from stages 3 to 5, you have a competition on the platform. So sellers choose their baseline fees and their additional fees. And then buyers, they draw a location on the hoteling line, draw their type, and they choose which seller to buy from. Now, when they choose, the design of the platform matters, right? So the buyers always observe the base price F, like the basic ticket price. And when the platform unshroud, when it's transparent, then they also observe additional fees of the seller S. However, when the platform shrouds, then buyers will not observe additional fees at this stage. And then, you know, the suspicious, sophisticated consumers can engage in this avoidance effort E or not. Then stage 5 is just to close the model. You know, buyers will pay the additional fees unless they did a precautionary avoidance effort. So in this setting, we look for perfect Bayesian equilibrium where naive consumers have false beliefs, as we just specified them in the last slide. Okay, so this is the baseline model, and we make many simplifying assumptions. But our results are robust to quite a range of robustness checks. But instead of going through those, I want to take this slide to show you what the key assumptions are that we do need and motivate why I think they are not problematic. So the first one is consumer mistakes. So given the extensive evidence in the literature on behavioral IO, some of which I have briefly discussed, we think this is not a problematic assumption. Especially much evidence on consumer mistakes is on online platforms. So we think that's an unproblematic assumption. Another one is that there are these sophisticated consumers that are more suspicious about shrouded fees, and these consumers act on their suspicion, right? So they can adjust their behavior to try to avoid shrouded fees. So we have a couple of interpretations for what this avoidance cost can be. I give you some of them I want to mention as examples. So there's one category of avoidance cost that we will call literally cost of avoiding an add-on, right? So we had the example of packing less luggage when you're suspicious about luggage fees. Alternatively, when you expect that, for example, shipping fees will be very high and you can't really change shipping fees easily, at least not for basic shipping. But what you can do is you do not buy another add-on, right? So if you see that shipping for your iPhone is very expensive, you choose not to have the fancy color of the iPhone, or you might choose not to get complimentary insurance. Right, so another way how you can avoid shipping fees is by going from fast shipping to standard shipping. Or if you're in a hotel, you can try to find alternative services elsewhere, right? So you can try to go to a coffee shop to have Wi-Fi. You can go to a restaurant elsewhere or to a gym elsewhere. On price comparison websites, more generally, what you can do is you can try to bypass the platform, contact the seller directly to learn about potential tricks and traps. And then you might even go back to the platform once you understand how to avoid tricks and traps to buy where it's potentially cheaper. Now, another way to interpret this avoidance cost is something we would call hassle due to shrouding. So that just captures the general idea that platforms, if they shroud, they make certain information or certain actions harder to access. And so this causes hassle of using these platforms. Right, so this is very much related to the idea of dark patterns, right? So that websites might be designed in a way that makes certain actions deliberately and unnecessarily complicated to discourage consumers from doing them, right? So if you don't think that's a thing, I would encourage you to try to quit your Amazon account. It's possible, but it's not at all intuitive and it's not at all easy. But more directly related to the applications we have in mind here. So there's some nice evidence on claimable rebates, right? So you might ask, why would platforms ask consumers to claim rebates? Why wouldn't they immediately apply them? Okay, you can have price differentiation reasons, but it's often very difficult and unnecessarily difficult to claim rebates. And there's some evidence that I'll discuss later on in the slide that this is, for example, a way to just induce hassle for consumers to discourage them from doing this action. Kind of related to this idea that shrouding induces hassle, there's a nice paper by Tobit Gamp and Daniel Kremer, where they show that sophisticated consumers in a sequential search model, they would search more because they would see when the product is deceptive, and then just as a result search longer. That's another way how we could think of these adjustment or avoidance effort. Okay, so we have mistakes. We have consumers who can be suspicious and act on this suspicion. And then there's the platform design. The platform can make fees more or less transparent. One feature already mentioned, one way to do this is drip pricing. Another example is steering consumers to expensive upgrades, for example. There's this nice paper by the two Allisons where they show that on the price comparison website, consumers are very price sensitive to basic versions of products, but then they are steered towards buying more expensive versions where they don't seem to compare that much anymore. Another way how platforms can be more or less transparent is by using their search algorithm, right? So they can, for example, favor transparent sellers in their search algorithm or favor more intransparent sellers, and thereby have an impact on how transparent features are on their marketplace. And so here's the example of rebate design that I mentioned. It's from a job market paper from a guy that was on the job market this year about rebate design. Shows that kind of using claimable rebates increases sales substantially, but at the same time, consumers overestimate their own tendency to actually claim these rebates later on, right? And the reason is that they overestimate how difficult it is to actually claim these rebates, right? So which very much, very well fits into the framework of our model. All right, so these are a couple of examples already mentioned. I would next now go into the analysis. If anyone has a kind of a question about the setting or the applications, this would be a good.
Johannes, I have a clarifying question.
Sure.
So do you understand correctly that you basically have covered market because you basically look at the hoteling, but is the market also covered when you look at basically the platform, because there is no platform competition, but is there some heterogeneity on the sellers and buyers, so they decide whether to join or not?
Yeah, excellent question. So I haven't shown that part of the model yet, but yeah, there is. So for the buyers, there will be. For the buyers, there's a participation. There's kind of a smoothly decreasing demand function for buyers.
Good.
For sellers, in the simple version we show, there isn't, but we can generalize that. That's just to simplify exposition. Thanks a lot for the question.
It's probably a bit too early, but are you also considering platform competition?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Not in this talk for reasons of time, but we do consider it. I'll mention it later when I talk about robustness checks.
Okay.
But so basically, also with competition, the problem won't disappear. That's the short answer. Okay, then let me go kind of zoom into the analysis of competition on the platform. So that's now the stages 3 to 5 of the model I've just shown you. And so recall the platform can essentially do two things. It can shroud or unshroud seller fees. So those are the two histories we have to consider. Let's start with the simpler one. Suppose the platform unshrouds seller fees. Unshrouding turns all naive buyers into sophisticated ones. They now observe additional fees when they choose a product. And so this means, sellers want to make sure these fees are low enough to avoid this hassle avoidance cost for consumers. And so once that is clear, you're basically in a classic hoteling model here, right? So the total price F plus A will be equal to the classic hoteling price. The profits that sellers earn for each buyer are like in a classic hoteling model. And the buyer surplus that buyers get from each seller are also as in a classic hoteling model. So things get a bit more interesting when the platform shrouds. Now, when buyers choose a product, they cannot condition their product choice on additional fees anymore because they don't observe them. And so as a result, the sellers will charge these fees very high at this high price level A upper bar. Now, sophisticated consumers anticipate that. And so they will try to adjust their behavior to avoid shrouded fees. However, naive consumers, they are not so suspicious. They will end up paying additional fees. Right, so what you have is now these naive consumers, they pay these large additional fees. So sellers do take that into account when they compete using base prices. So which is why the base prices will be reduced essentially by the amount of by the average shrouded fee you will earn from sellers. Right, so and what happens here is kind of what happens in many of these models with deceptive products. Essentially, so the revenues from shrouded fees will be used to reduce base prices for all consumers. So essentially, the naive consumers, they end up cross-subsidizing sophisticated consumers, right? So the revenues from shrouded fees, they'll end up making products cheaper for sophisticated consumers. So now what happens to the surplus per interaction for the seller surplus per buyer? Nothing changes, right? And that's the reason, you know, they compete with their base prices, so they will not really benefit from the shrouding and equilibrium. I mean, per interaction, overall profits might change, as you'll see. But so buyer surplus, perceived buyer surplus per interaction, I should say, that does change. And there are these two effects here that I highlight in red. So first you have this positive effect. And so that captures that these naive consumers, they pay these shrouded fees that they don't take into account. So for these consumers, when they choose a product, products look cheap. Right, so shrouding makes products look cheap. That's this positive component here. You also have this negative component, and that captures the hassle or avoidance cost for sophisticated consumers. Right, so these consumers now have a harder time using the website. They might try to avoid additional fees, and so that tends to reduce average perceived buyer surplus. Right, so to sum up, you see the seller profits per interaction do not change with shrouding, but the perceived buyer surplus per interaction does change. Right, so we have this trade-off that shrouding on the one hand makes products appear cheap to naive buyers. On the other hand, it induces hassle for sophisticated buyers. And so when you have sufficiently many naive consumers, then you will shroud, or like shrouding would increase perceived buyer surplus. Okay, so that.
Johannes, quick question by Simon Cordes. He writes,
Yes.
You basically imply that consumers do not know if they are naive or sophisticated before joining the platform?
Yeah, so that's a simplifying assumption we make, because it means kind of essentially all buyers are then ex ante homogeneous when they join the platform. That makes life simpler. So we do show in robustness checks that results are only reinforced when buyers know whether they're naive or sophisticated before they join the platform. So the basic reason is that when buyers already know that, or like know they're naive before they join the platform, then you have a selection effect. Naive buyers always believe products are more valuable than they actually are. So you will have more naive buyers joining the platform than they are in the population. So the share of naive buyers on the platform will be larger than in the population. And so that even reinforces shrouding incentives. But so in the baseline model I'm showing here, we assume that kind of when they join the platform, the buyers are ex ante identical for simplicity. Okay. So so now this was kind of the competition on the platform part. Now let's look at the platform design stage. I need to add two more components that Anton earlier asked about. So first, what are the costs for the platform? We assume the platform has zero marginal cost to serve buyers and sellers. That's a simplification, but it also seems reasonable for online marketplaces. Second, so what's the demand to join the marketplace? So we follow basically the Armstrong two-sided market setting here. So there's a value from joining the marketplace for buyers. So you have this surplus per interaction U that you get from each interaction with the number of sellers on the marketplace, NS, and then you have to pay the membership fee to join. For sellers, the value from joining is essentially their total profits. The total profits is pi, this profit they get per interaction, times the number of buyers. So those are the buyers. They interact with all buyers potentially, and you have to pay a membership fee, MS, to join the marketplace. Right, so you very much see how these surpluses per interaction that we've already seen earlier, endogenized, they capture the network effects here. the cross-group externalities, right? Take, for example, the buyer surplus U. If that one goes up, you see that, everything else equal, the value for buyers from joining will go up. Indeed, more buyers will join the platform. And when more buyers go on the platform, also the value of sellers goes up. Okay, now to close this demand, there's a mass one of potential buyers with a uniformly distributed outside option. So that's how I earlier mentioned to Anton's question. There will be the smoothly decreasing demand function for buyers. For sellers, we make a simplifying assumption. We assume they're homogeneous. They have the same outside option normalized to 0. That means the platform will extract all the surplus from sellers, and all sellers, the share 1 of sellers, will always join the platform. Again, that's a simplifying assumption. We can relax that. It really just makes the illustration of results much easier. Right, so now with this in mind, we fix demand and supply. We can now write down the platform's maximization problem. The platform chooses membership fees, and we, as a shortcut, we say the platform chooses the buyer surplus, the perceived buyer surplus U. That's just a shortcut for saying the platform shrouds or unshrouds. Right, we've seen earlier that shrouding only affects the perceived buyer surplus per interaction on the equilibrium path. So we just use this as a shortcut here. Okay, so we make 2 selection assumptions. So first we assume that buyers have a large externality on sellers. So this implies that that platforms strongly compete for buyers, so that membership fees for buyers will be 0. And we don't think that's a strong assumption, because that's true in literally any example we have in mind, where access is usually free for buyers to join the platform. We also focus on settings where the platform prefers to have duopoly sellers over monopoly sellers in each product category. We focus on settings where there is some degree of competition. We can give exact parameter regions for the kind of hoteling model and product categories when this is the case, but I'll spare you that. That's just complicated, but not very interesting. Okay, so now with all this baggage of a model in mind, we can now characterize when the platform shrouds seller fees. And so the first observation is a rather common one in two-sided markets. It's that larger buyer surplus per interaction, larger perceived buyer surplus U triggers a virtuous circle for the platform, right? So everything else equal, you will attract more buyers to the marketplace when they benefit more per interaction, and more buyers allow the platform to raise membership fees from sellers. All right, so that's why the platform decides between shrouding and unshrouding to maximize the perceived buyer surplus per interaction. And really what the platform wants to do is it just wants to attract as many buyers as possible. So now, luckily, we've already seen how the platform maximizes this perceived buyer surplus. We've seen the trade-off. Essentially, it trades off shrouding to look cheap to naive buyers or unshrouding to avoid hassle for sophisticated consumers. Right, so that leads to this cutoff we've already seen earlier. And again, so the intuition is simply naive buyers ignore large shrouded fees. So products look cheap to naive buyers, and they are indeed cheap to sophisticated consumers. On the other hand, there's the avoidance effort for sophisticated consumers. So that leads to this trade-off between shrouding to look cheap or unshrouding to avoid hassle for sophisticated consumers. Okay, so that characterizes how the platform chooses to shroud or not. But now we want to better evaluate what this means. So to do that, we compare the shrouding incentive of the platform with shrouding on a laissez-faire platform that just lets sellers shroud or not on their own. So that's essentially kind of we adapt kind of a version of the Gabe-Leibson paper to our setting, but it's essentially a result there already emphasized. And so this leads to our first main result, and this is that platforms have stronger incentives to shroud seller fees than sellers themselves on this laissez-faire platform. And so the basic intuition for that is that unshrouding has a negative externality on other sellers. So suppose you're on a laissez-faire platform, then there's this shrouding equilibrium where sellers both shroud, in each category, both sellers shroud their additional fees. And now an individual seller can unilaterally decide to unshroud and deviate from this shrouding equilibrium. By unshrouding, I could show as a seller to sophisticated buyers that I'm cheaper than they expect. So I will increase my demand from sophisticated sellers. However, formerly naive buyers will now see that products are more expensive than they thought. So even though as an individual seller, I can increase my own demand by unshrouding, I might also reduce overall demand and reduce the overall number of buyers on the platform. Right? So as an individual seller, I will not take this externality that unshrouding has on demand into account. As a platform, of course, I will, because I care about cross-group externalities. I care about having as many buyers as possible on the marketplace, which is why the platform will shroud more. Right? It wants to, in some sense, prevent sellers from competing by being transparent, because that can reduce the overall number of buyers on the marketplace. So, and I want to emphasize again, so even though sellers earn the shrouded fees, it's the platforms that shroud more, right? So that's, it's not so much important here who directly earns the fee. Really the strong incentive to shroud for the platform just come from the network externalities. They want to look cheap to attract many buyers. Okay, so before going to other results, I want to quickly connect this to evidence. So as I mentioned, there's some extensive evidence that drip pricing of shipping fees, taxes, service fees, or others on platforms increases demand. So we argue that this is hard to explain with rational consumers who correctly anticipate shrouded fees. So as I mentioned earlier, kind of everything else equal, drip pricing makes it harder to compare products. So search cost or transaction costs would go up using drip pricing. So you would, if anything, expect demand to go down. But this is not what happens. Demand goes up. And so I think we have a somewhat natural explanation for it. Drip pricing makes products look cheaper, and this attracts buyers. And it only makes product look cheaper because consumers don't correctly anticipate what's going on. There's also some evidence by Liram Einaf and co-authors and Kevin Tran from his job market paper. They look at eBay data. So the Einaf paper is eBay US, Kevin's paper is eBay Germany. And they find that kind of sellers should do one of two things with respect to their shipping fees. They should either offer very transparent and free shipping, or charge very large shipping fees. But what's never optimal for sellers is to charge a medium range of shipping fees. Also, that is very much in line with our results, right? So either as a seller, you would unshroud and make very low shipping fees, or if they're shrouding, you would charge very high shipping fees, but you would not do anything in between. Okay, so now, so that's the first bare-bone version of the model. So, and in practice, of course, a key feature that's missing is that platforms might also charge and shroud their own additional fees, right? So you can think, for example, about service fees or platforms selling their own complementary products like complementary insurance. So we add this feature to the model, to the previous model you've seen. And so we model the additional fees for platforms parallel to how we modeled it for sellers. So the buyers pay this additional fee, capital A, per interaction. That's what the platform sets, and the platform chooses also whether to shroud this fee or not. Again, naive buyers believe falsely that this is zero, and sophisticated ones have Bayesian posteriors. And again, sophisticated buyers can put this avoidance effort in. Also, as before, we assume that platforms have strong incentive to attract buyers because buyers have strong externalities on sellers. And as before, this means that platforms will compete, if you will, to attract buyers. So they will set unshrouded fees, membership fees in particular, equal to zero. Okay, now what happens here? So exactly because the platform has strong incentive to attract buyers, it always wants to look cheap towards buyers. Now it can look cheap in two ways. It can either unshroud additional fees and actually be cheap, right? So unshroud and set additional fees to zero. Or the platform can just look cheap without being cheap, right? So the platform shrouds additional fees, but sets actually large additional fees. So in equilibrium, the platform will do one of these two things. And the trade-off here is the following. Shrouding, on the one hand, allows the platform now to earn direct revenues from naive buyers, right? So this is in contrast to the previous model. Where now in equilibrium, the platform can earn money from buyers directly if it shrouds additional fees. However, again, there's this suspicion and avoidance cost of sophisticated consumers. The platform becomes a bit more annoying to use for these consumers. So you will have fewer overall buyers, which will reduce the revenues from sellers via cross-group externality. Right, so there's this trade-off, will be balanced in equilibrium. Again, there's some cutoff alpha prime, and if the share of naives is above this cutoff, the platform will shroud fees. So this cutoff is a complicated expression, but what is straightforward, I think, is the comparative statics of this cutoff. Particularly, what we can show is that it decreases in the buyer surplus U. What this means is that if there are more buyers, if the platform becomes more attractive for buyers, the platform has stronger incentive to directly earn revenues from these buyers, to cash in on these larger number of buyers. So when the platform becomes more profitable for buyers, it will also shroud more. Reversely, if the platform becomes more profitable for sellers, then the platform wants to shift on earning revenues from sellers. So now it unshrouds to attract more buyers and focus on earning revenues from sellers. Right, so what we think is interesting about these comparative statics is that it really links the shrouding incentive of the platform to other design features that just influence the surplus per interaction of buyers and sellers. In particular, we can link now how the degree of competition on the platform impacts shrouding incentive, right? So we can think of fiercer competition between sellers, simply increasing the buyer surplus and reducing the seller surplus per interaction. And then just using these previous results, we can show that fiercer competition between sellers encourages the platform to shroud its own fees more. And so you very much see like a perverse effect of fiercer competition on the platform. So the reason is simply that if you have fiercer competition on the platform, you will attract more buyers to the platform. And as we have seen, when there are more buyers on the platform, this increases the platform's incentives to directly cash in on these buyers, and to do so, it has to shroud its own additional fees. Right, so we even show in the paper that fiercer competition between sellers can even reduce total consumer surplus, and this is now total actual consumer surplus, so correcting for consumer mistakes. So the reason is just, there are regions where competition just increases a little bit, but now the platform wants to shroud, and this reduces participation and induces this avoidance cost, which is bad for consumers. Okay, let me see how I'm doing with time. Okay. So we think our results kind of nicely connect several empirical facts. So it connects to the prevalence of drip pricing on online platforms, and it also connects to how drip pricing works, right? So that it works by increasing demand. In our kind of setting, drip pricing is a way to shroud. It's a way to make products look cheaper to attract buyers. Let me jump over that. What I want to mention instead is that I think. So what our framework also explains, I think, a very common pricing pattern of platforms towards buyers. We very often see that platforms have free access for buyers, like free membership fees in our setting, but then they might charge service fees and add them later on in the purchase process. Right, so the first part, that there's free access, that we can explain with kind of classic platform settings just because of cross-group externalities. However, what's not so straightforward to explain is why then platforms give free access, but at the same time charge large and possibly shrouded hidden service fees, right? So why they charge service fees that are only drip priced to consumers, that are not very transparently advertised early on, right? So that's a feature that comes up very naturally in our setting, but I think it's not so obvious without naive consumers. So our results also nuance the common argument that online marketplaces facilitate comparison and encourage competition. We show that kind of cross-group externalities, as many classic papers show, encourage platforms to look cheap, but kind of we show that they can do that kind of in a perverse way, if you will. To look cheap, they have strong incentives to shroud seller fees and design an intransparent marketplace. Additionally, we show that platforms have strong incentive to shroud their own fees exactly when they induce fierce competition between sellers, right? So that's when they attract many buyers, and then they want to directly cash in on these buyers with shrouded fees. So there's indeed some evidence that platforms shroud a lot. It's suggestive evidence. You have to take this carefully. We take this carefully, at least. So there's a report for the EU Commission 4 years after the EU introduced all-inclusive upfront pricing for air tickets. And so this report states that of airlines, 13% violated this all-inclusive upfront pricing rule, but among online platforms, 24% violated this rule. Right? So we can think of many explanations for it, but one of them is that platforms violate this rule more often because they have stronger incentives to shroud. Kind of another piece of evidence would be, I've shown you a lot of evidence on kind of deceptive practices on platforms. These are studied quite widely in the empirical literature, suggesting that they're at least somewhat widespread, because they've been studied quite a bit in recent years. Okay, so let me see, maybe 2 or 3 more minutes. Let me briefly talk about policy implications. So our results also connect to the ongoing policy debate about the role of online marketplaces. Right, so Margit Vestager, EC Vice President, described platforms as private rule makers who set rules sellers have to follow. And we think our work very much connects to this perspective. Kind of we provide a framework to analyze this perspective in the context of transparency rules towards consumers. And our results suggest that regulators should not only rely on platforms to initiate consumer protection. Indeed, regulators seem increasingly active about obfuscated fees. I've given some examples on my second slide in the motivation. We have more in the paper. Another example about regulators becoming more active is the recent Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act proposals that, among many other things, also want to push platforms to be more active in enforcing existing laws, in particular, helping enforce existing laws with respect to disclosure of product features and fees. So then we also look at kind of more hands-on implications of kind of policies. One thing I already mentioned is that you might think about banning commissions or own brands to make intermediaries less biased, online intermediaries less biased. As you've seen, none of these features is relevant in our setting, suggesting that banning commissions or banning platform, like for example, discussed in the context of Amazon, banning platforms from selling their own products might not solve the problem, right? So even just with cross-group externalities, we argue that platforms have strong incentives to be transparent. We also look at kind of more hands-on regulations, but I will skip that for reasons of time. But the basic message here is kind of when you force platforms to unshroud or when you directly regulate additional fees, it depends, the effect of these policies depends on which fees you target. If you target seller fees, you will have a bigger impact on transparency. If you target platform fees, you will have a bigger, kind of more unambiguously benefit consumers. But I'll skip that for reasons of time. I rather would like to talk about one of the extensions. So that's a list of the main extensions we do. As I mentioned to Heiner earlier, we also look at competition. A key thing here is as long as platforms want to increase perceived buyer surplus to attract more buyers, our main results hold. And so we show here that this is also the case for some settings with competitive platforms. Right, so just that means competition alone will not help to induce platforms to unshroud more and to be more transparent. Then one extension I wanted to briefly talk about is price discrimination. So in the baseline model, everyone faces the same membership fees, but in practice we have something like basic Amazon and Amazon Prime, right? So which is just a form of second-degree price discrimination. So we can capture this in our model. Right, so think, for example, about a basic account that is for free and you have to pay additional fees. But there's also the Prime account where you have to pay a positive access fee. And what this account does is it automatically avoids any additional fees for you. right? It's very much like Amazon Prime, where you get shipping for free automatically, fast delivery, and you no longer have to worry about that. So what happens in our model? Well, sophisticated consumers, they will see the value in the Prime membership. They will see the value in no longer having to worry about additional fees. And so they will self-select into the Prime membership. However, naive consumers, they don't see this value. They think it's too expensive. They don't see the value of automatically avoiding additional fees. So these naive consumers will stay with the basic account. So what happens then, essentially these two types of consumers, they select into using different platforms, if you will. And so the platform can now no longer has this trade-off between shrouding to appear cheap or unshrouding to avoid hassle. Right? It can always shroud in the basic account and always avoid hassle with the Prime account. Right? So the platform, therefore, with price discrimination, if anything, will be even, will have larger incentives to shroud than in the baseline model. Okay, so let me wrap up. I don't want to use more time. I'm already beyond my limit. So the key takeaway, I hope, is that cross-group externalities really encourage platforms to look cheap, and this can have negative effects. That means platforms also might want to hide many fees. They want to shroud fees towards consumers who might not take shrouded fees into accounts. So thank you very much for your attention. Thanks a lot for the questions that you already asked, and I'm very much looking forward to additional questions if there's still time.